Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Bruce Hillman and Amy Mantravadi to talk about Amy's new book published with 1517 Publishing. But before we do that, I want to remind you that the Thinking Fellows is part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. And that while you are listening to this episode, you should go down to the description of this episode, look at the show notes. There's a bunch of links there. There will be a link to Amy's book and also to things happening at 1517 right now. You can click those. You can see new articles, videos, maybe other podcasts, and books, of course, for sale from 1517. All kept up to date there for you. So do not forget to check those every time you listen. All right, guys. Well, welcome to the show, Amy. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, and I'm so honored because I've seen that you just begun this series on some of the greatest Christian books of all time. And I heard that you started with John Chrysostom, and you're now featuring me and my book. And it is such an honor, and I await my anointing as the 5th female doctor of the church after this sterling endorsement.
That is convenient timing. You do definitely get to claim that you were in the great books of Christianity series, or whatever we end up naming that.
And you would be our Reformation book too, because we haven't gotten that far.
That's right. We haven't gotten to the Reformation yet. So why don't you, can you give everybody listening maybe some background for you? You're a contributor at 1517. You've been writing articles for, I want to say it's about a year, maybe a little more than that for 1517. And then, and now you've published a book with us.
Yeah, I started writing for 1517 about a year and a half ago. Originally found out about it just as I was doing research for the present book that we're to discuss. I wanted to learn more about Erasmus, so I searched for a podcast about Erasmus, and it came up with one by Dr. Stephen Paulson called Outlaw God. And as I always tell this story, I sort of thought that could go in one of a few different directions when I saw that the title was Outlaw God. But I listened, and then I started listening to another podcast called The Thinking Fellows, and now here we are. What are the chances that I would end up, talking to the Thinking Fellows? But I am a writer based in Dayton, Ohio. I live here with my husband and our young son, and I do two kinds of writing. I have theological essays that I write for 1517. I also write on Substack because that's what all the cool writers are doing now, and occasionally contribute to other places. And then I have these historical novels I've written. I had a previous series I wrote about Empress Matilda of England, who lived in the 12th century. But now I have the first of two that are going to be coming out from 1517 Publishing that are taking place during the Reformation, specifically the years 1524 to 25, and looking at the debate between Luther and Erasmus over the issue of free versus bound will, and also the third main character being Philipp Melanchthon, how that whole debate affected him. And looking not just at the two books that Luther and Erasmus wrote, but also looking at what was going on in the broader picture at that time with things we saw like the Peasants' Revolt that happened in 1525, the rise of new and novel and you might say more radical versions of Reformation theology. And basically that all of this created a situation where the world felt very chaotic, and it was a time of great anxiety for a lot of people. Looking back on the Reformation as we do now, it kind of seems like this glorious time of theological truth, which it was. But to live through it was a very everything seemed very contingent. They didn't know in the middle of it if it was going to survive or not. And they're dealing with political issues and even economic issues that are causing people to revolt for economic reasons. So it just was kind of crisis after crisis. And so I thought it would be a great way to look at the story and explore not only whether or not we have free will in regard to salvation, which Luther's going to answer in the negative, but also how much is God in control of history? And I think that at this point in time, a lot of people are feeling very anxious about world events. We've just had a pretty contentious election season. And regardless of where you stand politically, people are generally, I think, having a lot of concerns about, we have a couple of wars going on. We've had some economic shocks. Of course, we had the COVID pandemic. We've got pretty much all the horsemen of the apocalypse at this point. And just even looking at my social media feed over the last few weeks, I thought this is a time that people really need to understand that God is in control, but not only that he's in control, but that he loves them and that he is offering them grace and forgiveness and something that they can rest in. And so that is the general theme of my book and how I got involved with 1517.
All right. Well, that's great. I think for listeners, you can aspire to one day be on the Thinking Fellows as well. You just have to listen for a little bit and then start offering to write articles if you're got that sort of inclination, and you just might make it one day. So the book is, I find that the subject matter obviously is incredibly interesting as the host of two Reformation-oriented podcasts, and one, as you mentioned, that is now like 3 years of talking about the bondage of the will and looking like, probably my whole lifetime more talking about that book. And so, but why the decision to dramatize it? Like, who's the audience to do a historical fiction for? What's the person in mind? Is it somebody who's a student of the Reformation, or is it more like making it accessible to people who aren't going to be able to dive into the history or the letters between Luther and Melanchthon, or the context between Luther and Erasmus?
Well, first of all, I would say never write a work of fiction for any reason except that you cannot help but do otherwise. As Luther once said that he couldn't do anything otherwise. I think that is the only reason to write a novel, because it's a very risky endeavor. There are not many novelists that actually end up making considerable amounts of money. You have a few at the top who are getting very rich, and the rest are kind of slumming it. But I think for me, already being a novelist of sorts, a beginning novelist, when I came across this subject matter, perhaps that's why I initially had the thought to dramatize it. But this process of writing this book for me is absolutely linked to my personal spiritual development, because I grew up in a sort of generically evangelical background and attended a college that was sort of generically evangelical. I actually got a biblical literature degree there. So I definitely had a basic understanding of scripture and doctrine, but I had not gotten into historic theology or church history very much. And I reached this point in my life where I had this job where I was having to drive all over the place to interview people for this survey that they were conducting. And during that time, I thought, this is just wasted time driving through the soybean fields of Ohio. So I looked for something to listen to and ended up listening to this course on the history of the Reformation. And that was where I was first exposed to the theology of Martin Luther more deeply than just knowing that he was a guy who had once nailed something on a door. And I think most people have at least a vague idea of who Martin Luther is, even if they're not Christian. I certainly knew that justification by grace alone through faith alone was a big part of Luther's theology. But there are there is just a whole world beyond that. And I would say even just knowing that little bit of Luther's theology is not enough to classify him as a Lutheran. It's something that pretty much anybody, regardless of what they think about the sacraments or anything else, they can kind of say, well, we have this in common with Luther. But Luther's theology of how he understands salvation is so linked in with what he thinks about baptism and the Lord's Supper and the proclamation of the word and preaching. And so as I dove into that, that was the first time I learned that he had this feud with Erasmus. And I knew about Erasmus because I had done the Bible degree, and I knew about Erasmus as someone who had translated the Bible. So I had no idea that he was in any way linked to Martin Luther. So after hearing this, I just sort of, my mind was really captured. My imagination was captured by this story. And it was over an issue that I myself had wrestled with about this question of, do we have free will in regard to salvation? And at that point, I was pretty much on Erasmus's side of the argument and how I viewed things. And before I ever started researching to write a novel, I just went out and bought the 2 books and read them. And it was through that process of over a few months, I read through the Bondage of the Will very slowly and made lots of notes and really chewed on it and contemplated it. And that was how God sort of brought me kicking and screaming into this new understanding of salvation. And once that had happened, when it was such an important, I felt an important moment for me in my spiritual development, providing me with a degree of assurance of salvation that I don't think I had had before. That also made me want to share this with other people. And I know that as great of a book as it is, The Bondage of the Will is probably not going to appeal to everyone. There are some people who won't pick it up and read it once, let alone listen to the 15 years or whatever it's going to be of Outlaw God podcasts. So that's a shame, maybe, but keeping that in mind, this is a way that rather than just giving someone a straight up theological treatise, we can show them theological principles through a story by sort of taking the kinds of things that Luther and Erasmus said in their books and showing how they play out in real life. Because I actually don't quote that much from the books in the course of the novels. Rather, I kind of take these principles and sprinkle them in all over the place so that the whole story becomes this parable that's trying to tell you this, to communicate these spiritual principles. So I won't say that I don't talk about the books themselves at all, because I certainly do. They're a main part of the plot, but it would be kind of boring if I just had 3-page long quotations of text. So we find ways to do it that is sort of, it, captures people's imagination. Hopefully we'll get new people interested. I mean, already I've had so many people who I know would never be interested in this otherwise telling me that they're going to read the book. So that's really exciting and encouraging.
There's a couple of things you said. So like the towards the beginning, you were talking about Luther's sort of all-inclusive view of these doctrines being interlinked, and sort of not I think we've been emphasizing this more on Thinking Fellows too, that like these particular truths are not pick and choose your doctrine, sort of build your own theology. And for Luther, a lot of the frustration seemingly with Erasmus during that period of time had to do with sort of a pick and choose, starting with Scripture, and the frustration that Erasmus sort of knew the truth and was suppressing it because people were telling him to, or there was some other external pressure, or the church, or some other things going on. And so there's an element of sort of, trying to harass him into letting go of that position in a lot of ways, which is interesting, and I think does give you a great jumping off point for telling a story here, because the thing that I could see the novel doing is actually a lot of what we do on Thinking Fellows in parallel, or what a lot of theologians who are asked to go speak at conferences or at churches, and you only have an hour or two. It's not like extended class teaching is. You don't just sit there and quote from works for an hour, right? Or just outline doctrine for an hour. You make the Reformation interesting, because it is interesting. Like you said, it's a tumultuous and exciting period of history that has lasting consequences. And so you fill in, when you're teaching and when you're doing these podcasts, you fill in the personalities as you see them or as you've felt them reading through these materials throughout the year. And so there are some people who that frustrates. Like I find that this sort of extremely academic can get frustrated with that, because it feels like, oh, maybe you're implanting ideas or things onto these figures of history that aren't there. But for the average person, I do think it helps make the Reformation tangible, or make something like Thinking Fellows easy to listen to for a broader audience than just people who want to pursue theology as an academic issue. And so I could definitely see how doing this in an extended way through novelization can broaden the audience.
Yeah, and one of my goals that you sort of touch on there was to make sure that the Luther I was presenting these novels was actually a Lutheran Luther. Now, interestingly, I don't come from a Lutheran background, but when I write novels, I want to be accurate in how I portray things. Now, I do say and freely acknowledge that what I'm presenting here are not the real quote-unquote Luther, Erasmus, and Melanchthon, because I could never, even if I was living at the same time as them, I could never perfectly reproduce them in a novel. It's three characters that bear a very strong resemblance to those three people. But I think I have tried to show through various examples in the book how Luther's theology impacted the way he was thinking about the Lord's Supper, because at this time, this is when we're first starting to see the big push by some of the Swiss reformers against Luther's position, and he's having to deal with that for the first time, which, you know, is going to lead ultimately to the split between the Lutheran and Reformed movements. But also baptism and confession. There are a couple scenes in the book that take place with confession and absolution. And really what I'm trying to communicate through all this is the standard Lutheran and Reformation distinctive of law gospel theology. And in this book, we're going to basically see how Erasmus has what I think Dr. Paulson would call a very bad case of predestination sickness. He is really suffering greatly under the law. And I never say that in the book. And today Erasmus woke up and he's feeling the law very heavily. You know, no, you're going to see it come out in the way things that are making Luther feel positively are like negative to Erasmus and having this oppressive effect. And you have to be careful not to do too much psychologizing. I think particularly with Luther in the 20th century, there was a lot of psychologizing that happened. And, you know, you're going to get some of the truth from that, but never the whole picture. You can't diagnose people 500 years after the fact. But one thing I really feel in looking at Erasmus's background is he's a person who never really had, well, he had a father in his life, but not a father who could acknowledge him because he was the son of a priest. And so his relationship with his father, we like to talk about Luther's relationship with his father, but Erasmus's relationship is even more complicated because this is a father who cannot publicly associate or acknowledge him. And I just think, what does that do to you when you're then thinking about God as your father? And when you're thinking about election and whether or not God is electing you or not? You're probably going to think of election as something more oppressive as opposed to something free. You're going to look at it in a negative way rather than seeing it in the positive way that, for instance, St. Paul is presenting it in the New Testament as something that is an assurance for us. And so I go back and I look at, we have flashbacks to Erasmus and Melanchthon and Luther's childhoods or early adulthoods, seeing how different experiences they've had may have affected them in different ways. And of course, I can never be 100% sure. It was particularly difficult with Melanchthon because he doesn't, as an adult, give quite as many anecdotes about his time growing up. There are some, and, I read through a couple Melanchthon biographies, and they're able to research and find things. But I had a couple scenes in there for Melanchthon that are basically based on like a single sentence in one of the Melanchthon biographies and this happened. And now I have to theorize about what that would have been like and how it might have affected him. So that is a danger, which is
because he's got a lot of gaps. It is interesting though, because it is sort of an era of absent fathers. So, Melanchthon might not have the exact same type of father issues that both Luther and Erasmus have, but he's largely like raised in his young adulthood by his uncle instead. And so there is always this sort of, as that era of history is like fraught with, there's just nobody's a good father in a lot of ways. And it is interesting then to see how that affects the Reformation. Like Luther's emphasis on fatherhood, time and time again, is very interesting. And then his own sort of struggles with being a present father while also being sort of the head of this movement. And then too, Luther wraps Melanchthon into marriage and thus fatherhood very quickly into his young adult life also. And so there's definitely a lot going on there with those relationships, despite how little sort of some people wrote specifically about their life.
We have we've been covering a lot of ground here thus far, but what we have not covered is actually the name of the book. So I feel
Did we really miss it?
Yeah, we didn't say that. So, of course, the book is Broken Bonds, a novel of the Reformation, and it's book 1 of 2, correct? So this is people can look forward to a second one, which you put at the end of the book, a little bit of a teaser preview of that. But why don't you explain what's behind the title? I think always picking a title for a book is a hard thing. Maybe that's just for me, but you want it to grab people's attention. You also want it to kind of give a sense of what the book's about, but it's hard to do that in just a small little thing like a title. So how did you come up with the title, and what do you want it to reflect and say to potential buyers and those interested?
Well, Bruce, I'm going to let you in on a dirty little secret, which is that a lot of times authors actually don't pick the titles of their books.
That is true.
And now,
or the
always,
artwork. I was surprised by both of these things.
Now, okay, so I'll tell you the story. So definitely I was given final say as to the title of this book. If I had not liked it, we wouldn't have gone with it. But this was not the working title of the book. I had one working title for both volumes. After 1517 agreed to take them on, we then worked on titles for the 2 different volumes. And it was actually Rick Ritchie, who works as part of the publishing team, who came up with these 2 titles. And yeah, at first when he said Broken Bonds, I was thinking, okay, we're breaking free from slavery. The gospel's setting us free. That's very nice. And it wasn't until I heard him explain it, because I'm like, okay, so I'm going to be going on podcasts and having to explain what the name means. And I need to be completely sold on this, and I need to know exactly what to say. And he pointed out the fact that something that I absolutely did want to come out from my books, which is the number of broken relationships that occurred in the Reformation. So Caleb just mentioned the fact that Melanchthon ended up, from the time he was about 10 or 11, essentially being raised by his great uncle. I mean, he was going to one educational institution after another, but it was his great uncle, the great Hebrew scholar Reuchlin, who was overseeing all of this. It's Reuchlin who is going to get him this job at the University of Wittenberg and send him there after the more prestigious universities in the Palatinate, where Melanchthon is from, basically say you're too young or your ideas are too weird, and they don't want to hire him for that reason. And so Melanchthon goes off to Wittenberg just as Martin Luther is starting to come up with all these reformational ideas. And there's a great debate over who was more responsible for each of the ideas they came up with in those first couple years. There's a whole book written by Lowell Greed about basically emphasizing Melanchthon's role in coming up with a lot of those initial doctrines that you can get from the 1517 shop. But what's going to happen is in 1519, Luther and his colleague Karlstadt are going to end up debating Johann Eck at the University of Ingolstadt. By this point, Melanchthon's great uncle, Reuchlin, is a professor at the University of Ingolstadt and very good friends with Eck. And so basically when this falling out occurs and Reuchlin becomes convinced that they've treated Eck very badly, and he basically wants Melanchthon to, grovel and apologize and stop. It's like when people talk about now, they send their kids off to college and they come back with all these woke ideas. It's kind of similar situation. And
look what Luther put in your head, and
yes, exactly. And Melanchthon's like, I'm sorry, but I'm convinced that this is true. And so Reuchlin writes him out of the will. And really the biggest thing in those days, he does not get Reuchlin's private library of books, which, as a book lover myself, I imagine how terrible a blow that would be. But Reuchlin was like a father figure to him. And I think Melanchthon wanted to be Reuchlin to a large extent until he ended up in Wittenberg and kind of got in a different path. So, even with him, the idea of a father who's kind of rejected you, he definitely had that too. And so I wrote these books at a time when I had seen some friends of mine and different people that I was connected with kind of fall out with each other. And I think that maybe just because of the political climate and COVID and all kinds of things that had happened, we have seen a lot of people, maybe more than usual, falling out over different things within Christianity in America. And I thought this was a good time to speak to that as well, because I think the Reformation was sort of you have on this macro level, the split of the church. But on a micro level, you have people in the same family who stop talking to each other. And people who, you think about Zwingli in Zurich, some of his former colleagues, he's going to end up watching while they get drowned in the river because now they're Anabaptists. It's incredible the way that people are turned against each other. And so I wanted to explore that as well. So that dual meaning is where Broken Bonds comes from.
So do you think there's a lesson to be learned in – I'm trying to ask a question without giving my own thoughts on an answer. Is there a lesson to be learned in the way that the Reformation unfolded, just with the personalities? I'm talking on a personal level, not a theological lesson, but just a personal lesson about what it costs people to stand up for what they believed in on the different sides. And is there some type of personal, non-theological message that you hope someone wants to learn from this period of history and how these characters interacted? Could it have been done better if they had somehow acted differently, or did it have to sort of go down the way it went down? What do you think?
If we're thinking about something like the ultimate divide between the Lutheran and Reform movements, I think that was probably pretty inevitable. There may be a little difference as to where the line gets drawn. If they're able to bring in someone like, after Zwingli, who was much more towards, maybe you could say a little further out there than Calvin would end up being. Could they? There was one attempt at one point to kind of make the Augsburg Confession acceptable to certain Reformed people. And really everyone now thinks that was a terrible idea. So you could maybe debate.
That's debatable if that's what the Variata was meant to do, but we can
yes, of course.
Whole other episode on that.
These things are always debatable, but I think there's going to be a line drawn. It's just a matter of where it's drawn. But it is a good point because we don't want to reduce everything to people's personal lives, but every decision that gets made in the Reformation is on one level personal and affected by people's personal context. And for instance, why does Luther come down much harder on some other people than he does on Melanchthon? He had a few, as they went on, there were, we can debate how much Luther and Melanchthon really disagreed, but he's never going to publicly oppose Melanchthon in print on anything, as he did some other people who you could say maybe were almost as close to him. Well, because they had this personal relationship. And I don't think that's just favoritism. I mean, they had fought in the trenches together. They trusted each other in a way that, a lot of the people that Luther wrote against or corresponded with, he'd never met in person. So that doesn't have much of a basis of trust there. But also, I explore the fact that during the time that this story happens, Melanchthon's family, they have their second child, and that birth is a pretty traumatic one. And just having gone through a lot of medical kind of things with my own son, it's like a constant buzz in your head that affects everything. And it's hard to separate, all the other things you're doing in your life from this thing that is constantly just in your head. And I think there are probably lots of things like that we'll never know about because they just weren't recorded. But for me, it makes me want to give a little grace to people who lived then, because they were very human. And I know that a lot of times I'm not making the best decisions or doing my best work because, some big family emergency has happened or whatever is going on. And they're the same. And we tend to read their theological works in a vacuum, not thinking about the exact context they're written in. And particularly with Luther, that's a big mistake, because Luther was such an occasional theologian, which we always like to say. That doesn't mean he only did theology occasionally. It means he addressed particular occasions. But I mean, I think without understanding the context in which something like the Bondage of the Will is written, you're not going to fully understand it.
Yeah, it is sort of an incredible set of stories that lead up to that. And yeah, Luther and Melanchthon's relationship is very interesting. You get the sense that Luther cared for Melanchthon and felt responsible for him and felt personal responsibility for some of the harm or damage incurred to him as well. So like when Reuchlin writes him out of the will, Luther goes out of his way to get Melanchthon's salary vastly increased in Wittenberg, and to get him property and a home and like an extensive, a bunch of things he essentially lost out on, right? Through that. And there's a lot that goes on there. And then the Bondage of the Will, and this is what gets interesting, brings about one of the most sort of tumultuous times in their friendship, which is interesting because it's not really an assault on like Melanchthon's position on the will or something like that, but has to do with Melanchthon's, I think, like another example of how mistreatment of somebody or speaking in a particular way could lose them one more potential ally and one more person who, I think Melanchthon cared more about this than Luther, seemingly, without whom there would be no Reformation. And so I think, yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting period of time to try to capture too, because there's a lot going on at the. I do wonder, Amy. So we've had like moments at various conferences to talk about Melanchthon briefly. You got into this from recognizing Luther and Erasmus. Of the three both in your story, but in history, sympathize with the most, or who do you find to be the most sort of compelling of them in this sort of case? And do you agree with like some of Melanchthon's assessment of Luther at the time, or of sort of being too heavy-handed with Erasmus and things like this?
I'll start with the Luther-Erasmus relationship in 1525 and then move on to why maybe that'll help to make clear why I thought Melanchthon should be a character in the book. So basically, you've got three things going on in 1525. You have this feud between Luther and Erasmus, which I say it's a feud, but really Erasmus has been egged onto it by like King Henry VIII and a couple of popes. And so he was sort of unwillingly dragged from his plow to make this argument against Luther. But Melanchthon comes from a much more humanist background. And probably people who have listened a lot to the Thinking Fellows understand what I mean when I say humanist. But for those who don't, we're not talking about secular humanists today. The one way in which they're connected to Renaissance humanists is that they have this kind of positive view of what humanity can accomplish through reason and education. But the humanists of the Reformation period were Christians. And many of them went on to be Protestant reformers. But it has to do, it's an educational model as much as anything. It has to do with kind of moving away from the medieval scholastic form of education to something that's newer. And Melanchthon is absolutely tied to that, not only through his own education, but his great uncle, Reuchlin, is a major player in all of that. And through Reuchlin, he's tied to Erasmus because Reuchlin and Erasmus are friends. And as Melanchthon's growing up, there was this time when Erasmus made this comment that basically Melanchthon is already the brightest shining star in Germany. He's going to be the one to save, good education. And I think he was absolutely right in assessing Melanchthon's talents. But that's was a true. Big thing to carry. And And I think Melanchthon, because so many of the early Protestant reformers do come from a Protestant background, our correspondents of Erasmus look up to Erasmus and how he has made their work possible. I think Melanchthon's concern, more than just personally upsetting Erasmus, is that those people who respect Erasmus will now be looking at the way that Luther has written against him, and that will cause them to lose some potential allies.
And at that point, I believe Melanchthon still thought Henry could be convinced to support Lutheranism. It wasn't a bridge totally burned. And so, the extent to which he then should treat Erasmus, who's sort of also involved with the King Henry situation, is potentially losing out on a whole nother country of support for the Lutheran cause.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex web. So you have that feud going on, and Melanchthon's very nervous. It takes Luther a long time to respond to what Erasmus has written, and that really seemed to bug Melanchthon. But we also have the situation with that enormous peasant uprising. And just to give people an idea, I mean, I've heard sometimes 40,000 is the number of people killed. Sometimes I've heard up to 100,000. It is an enormous conflict. It's the biggest popular uprising in Europe prior to the French Revolution. And it's happening at the same time. And then right in the middle of that, Luther gets married without informing Melanchthon beforehand. And that all just kind of creates this perfect storm of upsetness. But one other factor that I think is there that maybe we don't always think about, because it does involve a little bit of psychologizing, although I don't think it's going too much out on a limb, is that while Luther was staying in the Wartburg Castle in 1521 to 22, Melanchthon and Karlstadt are kind of left behind in Wittenberg to lead the movement and keep the work of reform going. And for those who are familiar with the story of the Reformation, that kind of ends up being a bit of a fiasco, and we've got all kinds of crazy stuff happening. And when the dust has settled on that, I think a lot of people feel that Melanchthon didn't do a great job of being a leader while Luther was gone. Literally, I mean, it's recorded, whether this is apocryphal, but it's recorded that when Luther was getting in the car or to go off to Worms to talk to the emperor, he said to Melanchthon, "It's okay if I die as long as you're still here." He's basically he's like Elijah handing off the mantle. And then basically, I mean, you can say he kind of failed to properly wear the mantle. And this happens at a time when Melanchthon's only like early 20s at this time, maybe 22 or so. I can't remember exactly. I think he was born in 1497. So he's very, very young to be leading something like that. And to have basically this first time you really tested turn out to be a fiasco. I suspect I don't think Luther actually thought badly of him for that, but I'm willing to bet that it had this lingering effect and created a little tension. I think the relationship between Luther and Melanchthon was a little different after Luther came back, both because their work had changed and because Melanchthon was married and had a child by then. So yeah, that creates a very interesting tension. And this is why I thought so good to feature Melanchthon's perspective on the whole thing. And it allows for this dynamic where we kind of have Erasmus on one side of the continuum and Luther on the other, and Melanchthon's in the middle getting kind of torn this way or that. Now, I think sometimes the degree to which Melanchthon is close to Erasmus theologically gets overstated by his critics. I think he definitely is sold on Luther's theology, but there are other personal factors that are causing him to feel like he's getting torn in both directions. And I thought that's something very interesting to feature because there have been times in my life where, certainly not on that kind of grand scale, but I felt kind of the tension of being torn between two things. As far as which character I sympathize with more, around this time, Luther made the quip that he had 3 different wives at the same time, and they were the 3 nuns that he was trying to, get matched up. I won't say that I had 3 husbands while I was doing this book, but maybe 3 brothers, maybe we could go with. I honestly love them all. I like to say I'm probably the only person who honestly loves all 3 of these people, as writers. So Erasmus's theological viewpoints I am not much in line with now, but I still appreciate all the work he did. I mean, really, a lot of the Reformation happened because of his work of Bible translation and translation of other ancient sources, opening that door for people to, then go further with it. So I think Erasmus, to me, is a very tragic character. I just pity him a lot because he ended his life very deeply unhappy. Melanchthon also ended his life somewhat unhappy for different reasons. But what Melanchthon and Luther both did have was this assurance that comes from their better understanding of the gospel and being able to distinguish law from gospel. Because as we see in Erasmus's book, The Freedom of the Will, and Luther will point out many times over, Erasmus has a lot of trouble differentiating law from gospel when he's reading scripture. And that's going to, I think, be the source of a lot of his discontent.
I see it, in the book, you divide your book into sort of 4 main movements or sections, and you do that seasonally in, spring, summer, autumn, and then winter. What made you decide to sort of divide it up in this seasonal framing?
I don't have a great answer for that. I can tell you that somewhat it helps because it's maybe a little better than dividing into a ton of chapters because it helps us to keep track of the fact that we're switching from one person's perspective to another and that they're happening somewhat simultaneously. So it helps us to appreciate how the narratives of these 3 people are weaving together. But also, I tried to do some things in these books to help people to think from a 16th century perspective. I can't do that perfectly because I'm not a 16th century person. And if you go too far with that, it becomes almost unreadable for a modern person. But they were much more than us thinking in terms of seasons, in terms of this calendar of feast days and different things. And of course, the Reformation is going to revolutionize a lot of that. But they are much more tied to the earth and to agrarian ways of life. And so for them, I think that would have been a pretty common way to think of the year. And I thought it sort of made sense, just given the number of scenes I had, it would have been kind of, in the 3 different perspectives, it would have been awkward to try to make like each scene a different chapter just to group them by season seemed to make more sense to me. But I didn't have like a spiritual reason for doing it. I wish I did. I wish I had some great spiritual answer to give you. But
no, I didn't think there was necessarily a spiritual reason. I just thought it was an interesting way to kind of frame the movements through the different back and forths of the characters. And I didn't know if there's any deeper meaning to it, but for me, it covers a year in that sense, in the sense of the way it's framed with the seasons. And people tend to think of a year as a sort of period of completeness. Where if you had written a book with just 2 seasons, there would be a sense of feeling like, well, there's an incompleteness there. So I thought it was interesting that it was sort of like, okay, there's this whole year-long framing, and look at all the different things that are happening as these seasons are changing, and it sort of builds this momentum, like we're going somewhere because we're in a year. So maybe I read way more into it than what you intended.
No, one thing I did think about is because originally I was just thinking of one narrative, and then as I went on, it became clear that it needed to be 2 different books. Dividing it the way I did between 2 different years means that both times we're ending with the season of Christmas, which is the darkest time of the year. We think of it as this great season of light, but it's also the darkest time of the year. And this is sort of a narrative that digs into darkness quite a bit, spiritual darkness, emotional darkness, but that also ultimately is looking at the light that's coming into the darkness. So at the end of the year, we've had this long season of Advent where we're kind of in this already and not yet, and we're longing for God to show himself, for God to come. And then at the end of the year, when it's darkest, the light is going to come in. And I think that symbolism worked out pretty well, being able to end both books like that because of the way that it was set up.
Well, cool, guys. I mean, we made it basically perfectly to the time that we usually wrap up at Thinking Fellows. So, Amy, thanks for coming on the show. I mean, this is, like I said, this is a fun topic for me. We could do, I could do a year of Thinking Fellows of just sort of talking about each and every one of sort of the relationships between these characters as well. So it's definitely a fun topic. If you're looking to sort of get a new angle on the Reformation, have some fun, Amy's book is available. You can go to the link in the show notes below, where I'll have links to both the 1517 shop and to Amazon. That's Broken Bonds, a novel of the Reformation, if you decide to search it yourself and not use the links. As we discussed here, it's also an accessible way to maybe, if you or somebody you know has been sort of scared off by the bondage of the will or something like that, or thinks those things are too academic or heady, this might be a fun way to do that. I know there are people who basically exclusively read novels. My wife is one of them. So this might be appealing to somebody in your life like that. Thanks, Amy, for coming on the show. Thank you, listeners. We will catch you next time. Bye.